23 stabs. It was not an execution. It was a ritual, a bloodbath in the marble heart of Rome. The man who believed himself a god, Gaius Julius Caesar, lay bleeding at the feet of the statue of his greatest enemy, Pompey the Great. The irony is brutal. The assassin senator's men who had dined with him the night before raised their bloody daggers. They did not flee, they shouted. They proclaimed themselves liberators. They believed that on that day, the Ides of March in 44 before Christ, they had saved the Republic, cutting off the head of the serpent of tyranny. In their arrogance, they thought the people of Rome would take to the streets to acclaim them, to thank them for restoring freedom. But the people did not applaud them. The silence in the Forum was their first death sentence, a heavy, dense silence laden with fear. Not fear of the dead tyrant, but of them, the men who had unleashed chaos. Why did the people they claimed to have saved receive them with dread and not with flowers? Because the common Roman did not live in the senator's villas. They lived in harsh reality. And Caesar the tyrant had given them stability, victories, and bread. The liberators, on the other hand, offered only an abstract idea of freedom and blood. The mastermind behind the conspiracy, Gaius Cassius Longinus, a man consumed by personal resentment, and the face, the symbol, Marcus Junius, Brutus Caesar's adopted son, the man whose betrayal dealt the mortal wound. They say Caesar's last words upon seeing his face were not of anger, but of painful surprise. "You too, my son," they believed they had won. They marched to the capital. They entrenched themselves, expecting the city to recognize them as the new fathers of the homeland. They underestimated one man, a man who had not wielded a dagger, but whose words would be sharper than any steel, the consul, Mark Antony. And worse, they underestimated a ghost, a name. Hundreds of miles away in Apollonia, an 18-year-old frail and unknown youth received a letter. They informed him that his great-uncle Julius Caesar had been assassinated. But that was not the news that would change the world. The real bombshell was in the will. Caesar had adopted him as his son and primary heir. That young man, ignored by all, would become the embodiment of vengeance. He did not inherit only Caesar's fortune, he inherited his name, and with that name, a blood oath. His name was Gaius Octavius. His arrival in Rome would mark the beginning of the end for each of the 60 men who drove their steel into his adoptive father's body. They did not yet know, but they had not killed a man. They had unleashed two monsters' civil war in Octavius. The hunt was about to begin and would not stop until the last of the liberators paid their debt in blood. For a moment it seemed that blood would not call for more blood. In a desperate move to avoid civil war, the Senate granted amnesty to the assassins. A fragile, tense pardon. Brutus and Cassius descended from the Capitol, believing they had weathered the storm. They even dined with Mark Antony in a truce as false as the smiles on their faces. They controlled the Senate, had the daggers, and thought they had the power. Their mistake was allowing Caesar to have a state funeral. Brutus spoke first. His speech was a work of stoic logic, cold, rational, philosophical. He appealed to virtue, duty, and love for the Republic. He explained that he did not kill Caesar out of hatred, but out of love for Rome. Not that he loved Caesar less, but that he loved Rome more. The confused crowd nodded. They seemed to accept the terrible necessity of the act. The liberators breathed a sigh of relief. But then Mark Antony stepped onto the rostra. He did not shout, did not accuse. His voice was a whisper of pain that nonetheless reached every corner of the Forum. "Friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears," he began. "I come to bury Caesar, not to praise him." He said Brutus was an honorable man, that they all were. He repeated the phrase several times, honorable men. And with each repetition, the word honorable rotted, turning into poison, a sarcasm as sharp as a razor. Then he bent down and lifted the toga covering Caesar's body. The purple fabric, stiff with dried blood, revealed the 23 gashes. "Look here," entered Cassius's dagger. "See what a gash the envious Casca made. And through this one the beloved Brutus stabbed." He turned a political assassination into a personal slaughter. He made the crowd see not a tyrant, but a betrayed man. And then the final blow, he pulled out a scroll of papyrus, Julius Caesar's will. The crowd held its breath as Antony read that Caesar bequeathed his private gardens to the people of Rome to be public parks forever. And then the coup de grace. Caesar left to every Roman citizen, to every man in that square, a sum of 75 drachmas. Hell broke loose. Brutus's logical speech evaporated in the face of raw emotion. The people's love for their murdered benefactor exploded into an uncontrollable wave of violence. They tore apart the benches and tables of the forum to build an improvised funeral pyre for their hero right there. Then with torches lit from that sacred fire, the mob turned into a pack of wolves. They no longer sought liberators, they sought assassins. Their first victim was an unfortunate poet named Gaius Helvius Cinna. They mistook him for one of the conspirators, Lucius Cornelius Cinna. His pleas didn't matter, nor did it matter that he shouted he was only a poet. He was torn limb from limb in the streets. It was the first payment of the blood debt. Brutus, Cassius, and the others saw the flames of their homes. They saw the people they claimed to have freed marching toward them with torches and knives. Their Republican dream had become a nightmare. They had to flee Rome like thieves in the night. They were no longer senators, they were fugitives. And while they ran for their lives to the east, the real danger of the young Octavius landed in the southern Italy. He brought no army but something far more powerful, Caesar's name, and a fortune that would soon seem inexhaustible. And he was about to use both to buy the loyalty of Rome's deadliest weapon, his father's legions. While Rome burned and the assassins fled, Octavius played his own game, a chess match on a board of razors. Upon arriving in Rome, he presented himself to Mark Antony, the new master of the city. Antony saw him as he was a pale, inexperienced youth, a mere inconvenience. He refused to hand over Caesar's fortune, using the money to consolidate his own power. It was a miscalculation that would cost him the world. They underestimated his name. Octavius began signing as Caesar Octavian, a stroke of genius for the people and the legions. He was Caesar, and when Antony denied him the money, Octavius did the unthinkable. He sold his own properties and those inherited from his family to pay the people the 75 drachmas promised in the will. He kept his father's word. Overnight, the young man became the favorite of the plebs and, more importantly, of Caesar's veteran legions. Battle-hardened men who had worshipped the general saw in that youth the reincarnation of their leader. Octavius did not ask for loyalty. He bought it with money promises and, above all, the power of an immortal name. He stole Antony's legions before his very eyes. The tension exploded. The two avengers of Caesar declared war on each other. But while they fought in northern Italy, alarming news arrived from the east. Brutus and Cassius were not wasting time. They had plundered the eastern provinces, amassing a gigantic war chest. They recruited and trained 19 legions, a formidable army funded by extortion and ready to march on Italy. Antony and Octavius realized a terrifying truth. They hated Caesar's assassins more than they hated each other. They met on a small island in a river near Bologna. Antony, Octavius, and a third man, Lepidus, Caesar's general. There, amid the mud and mist, these three men formed the second triumvirate. It was not an alliance, it was a pact of predators. They divided the world like spoils, and to fund their war and eliminate their enemies at home unleashed terror. The prescriptions were not a simple list of enemies. They were a public death sentence. Hundreds of senators and thousands of the wealthy class were declared enemies of the state. Their names, written on plaster tablets, were nailed to the forum. Anyone could kill them. Not only was it allowed, there was a reward. The killer received a portion of the victim's wealth. The rest went to the triumvirate. Rome sank into bloody paranoia. Slaves murdered their masters for freedom. Sons betrayed fathers for inheritance. No one was safe. And on that list, Antony demanded one name above all: Marcus Tullius Cicero, Rome's greatest orator. Cicero was not one of the assassins, but his speeches against Antony had condemned him. Octavius, who owed his political rise to Cicero, agreed. He sacrificed him without hesitation. Antony's assassins caught up with him near his villa. Cicero ordered his servants not to resist and offered his neck. They cut off his head and hands, the same hands that wrote the speeches that so offended Antony. They were brought to Rome, and in an act of supreme barbarity, nailed to the rostra, the platform where Cicero had spoken so many times. The vengeance was total. With Rome purged and their coffers filled with the blood of their enemies, the triumvirate turned its gaze eastward. The purge was over. Now the war began. Brutus and Cassius were not hiding. They had gathered in Greece with their 19 legions. The final confrontation that would decide the Republic's fate was inevitable. The end of the Roman world converged on a Greek plain called Philippi. It was not one army against another. It was one era against the next. On one side, Octavius and Antony, with Caesar's name as their standard and vengeance as their fuel. On the other, Brutus and Cassius, with the dying idea of the Republic and the memory of a bloody dagger. Over 200,000 men, the greatest concentration of Roman military power history had ever seen, about to annihilate each other. The liberators' plan was cunning, dictated by Cassius's cold logic and experienced general. Their army was better supplied and controlled the sea. The strategy wait, avoid a pitched battle, let hunger and disease wear down the triumvir's legions. But Brutus was no strategist. He was a philosopher turned general. He was tormented. They said omens in his camp were dire. 2 eagles that followed their legions were replaced by crows and vultures the day they reached Philippi. And legend says that nights before the battle, a ghostly, terrifying apparition appeared in his tent. "Who are you?" asked Brutus. The shadow replied, "I am your evil spirit, Brutus. We shall meet at Philippi." Was it Caesar's ghost or the ghost of his own guilt? Pressured by his impatient officers and tormented by his demons, Brutus imposed his will. They would force the battle. Cassius, against his judgment, yielded. The first battle of Philippi was a chaos of blood and dust. On the right flank, Brutus's legions, with unstoppable fury, crushed Octavius's, broke their lines, massacred their men, and looted their camp. Octavius, sickly, barely escaped with his life. From his perspective, it was a crushing victory. The Republic seemed to be reborn in one glorious assault. But at the same time, on the other flank, the story was radically different. Mark Antony's veteran troops, more disciplined, destroyed Cassius's legions. Antony's attack was brutal, relentless. Cassius's camp was taken, his men massacred, the survivors fleeing. 2 simultaneous battles with opposite outcomes, and in the middle, the fog of war. Cassius had retreated to a hill to observe the battlefield. He saw in the distance that Brutus's camp was taken, but he could not know it was Brutus's own men celebrating and looting. Then he saw a detachment of cavalry galloping toward him. They were Brutus's men coming to announce victory, but in the dust and distance, Cassius thought it was the enemy cavalry. He believed Brutus had been defeated. He believed all was lost. The fog of war and a cloud of dust sentenced the man who started it all. "Take it," he said to his freedman, handing him a dagger. "Free me from life." Pindrus obeyed. Cassius covered his face with his cloak and received the blow. He died at the hands of his own slave, using, according to legend, the same dagger he had plunged into Julius Caesar in the Senate. The final irony for a practical man defeated not by the enemy, but by a tragic illusion. Soon after Brutus's messengers reached the hill, shouting news of his victory, they found only their commander's corpse. When Brutus arrived and saw his friend and brother-in-law's body, his spirit broke. He called him in tears the last of the Romans. Cassius, the conspiracy's brain, was dead, but Brutus, the movement's soul, still lived. He commanded an army that was still formidable. For 3 weeks, the 2 sides watched each other, tension growing with each dawn. Brutus knew time was against him. His men were demoralized. Victory had turned to ashes in his mouth. Pressured by his own troops and tormented by Caesar's ghost, he made the decision that would seal his fate. He ordered a second and final attack. 3 weeks. 21 dawns in which the remnants of the Republic's greatest army and the embodiment of Caesar's vengeance faced each other across a blood-soaked valley. In Brutus's camp, morale had collapsed. Cassius's ghost and his pointless death weighed on everyone. His legionaries, many of them mercenaries, began to desert. His officers pressed him, demanding one last battle before the entire army dissolved. Brutus, the philosopher, the idealist, no longer had control. He was trapped in the chain of events he himself had set in motion. The Second Battle of Philippi lacked the chaotic uncertainty of the first. It was a slaughter. Brutus's legions attacked with desperation, not conviction. They faced Antony and Octavius's veteran troops, hardened men, better commanded, fighting for victory, not to avoid defeat. The Republican lines gave way, then broke. The retreat turned into a chaotic flight. The Republic's dream did not die with a defiant cry, but with the sound of thousands of men running to save their lives. Brutus managed to escape the battlefield with a handful of his most loyal officers. They hid in the nearby hills, hearing their enemies' victory cries, and the sound of Antony's cavalry scouring the area searching for him. The man who had ruled Rome for a moment was now a hunted fugitive in the darkness of a Greek forest. There in the cold night, Brutus knew it was over. He looked at his friends and spoke words that revealed the fracture of his soul. He lamented that the virtue for which he had sacrificed everything might be just an empty word, and that he had been a slave to fortune. The idealist crashed against the wall of reality. He had killed his friend and mentor for an idea, and that idea had just died before his eyes. He would not allow himself to be captured. The humiliation of being dragged through Rome's streets in Octavius's triumphal parade was a fate worse than death. He asked one of his officers, Clitus, to kill him. Clitus refused, weeping. He asked another, Dardanius, who also refused. Finally, he approached his friend Strato. He asked him to hold his sword with the point aimed at him. Strato, with tears in his eyes, obeyed. Brutus used his last strength to run and impale himself on the blade. He died instantly. The soul of the conspiracy was extinguished. Soon after, Antony's men found his body. Mark Antony, in an unexpected act of nobility, removed his priceless purple general's cloak and covered his enemy's corpse. Later, he would say that Brutus was the noblest of all Romans, the only conspirator who acted for an ideal, not out of envy. Octavius did not share this respect. When they brought him the news, his reaction was cold. He ordered Brutus's head to be cut off and sent to Rome to be thrown at the feet of Julius Caesar's statue. Octavius's vengeance knew no nobility, only total annihilation. The contrast between the two victors in that moment planted the seeds of the war that would come between them. With Brutus and Cassius dead, the conspiracy's heads were cut off. To the world, the civil war was over. But Octavius did not see it that way. For him, the vengeance was not complete until every one of the 60 men who wielded a dagger that day was dead. The Great War was over. Now began the silent hunt, a purge that would extend to every corner of the Mediterranean. For the remaining assassins, hell was just beginning. After the Battle of Philippi, the power of the Roman world rested in the hands of 3 men, and one of them, Octavius, had an obsession. The list of the 60 men who participated in his father's assassination. Brutus and Cassius were only the first 2 major names to be crossed off. Dozens remained, and now the triumvirs had armies, fleets, spies, and a nearly limitless treasury to find them. There was no corner of the Mediterranean where they could hide. The amnesty had been a farce. Prescription was now the law. Gaius Trebonius, the man who cunningly kept Mark Antony out of the Senate, while the others stabbed Caesar. He believed himself safe as governor of Asia, but a general loyal to Antony captured him, tortured him for days for information, and then beheaded him. His head was used as a ball by soldiers in the streets of Smyrna. He was one of the first to die, a brutal warning of the kind of mercy they could expect. Decimus Junius Brutus Albinus. Not to be confused with Marcus Brutus. Decimus was one of Caesar's closest friends, one of his most brilliant generals. Caesar had named him in his will as a secondary heir if Octavius declined. It was he who, on the morning of the Ides, convinced a hesitant Caesar to go to the Senate. An intimate and devastating betrayal. After Philippi, his legions in Gaul abandoned him. Suddenly, the powerful general was a man alone. He tried to cross the Alps disguised as a Gallic chieftain. He sought refuge with a local chief he once called a friend. But loyalty has a price, and Decimus Brutus's head was worth a fortune. The Gallic chief did not hesitate. He murdered him in his own home and sent the head as a gift to Mark Antony. The friend who convinced Caesar to walk to his death was betrayed by a friend for the promise of gold. One by one they fell. Lucius Cassius, brother of the main conspirator, was assassinated on Octavius's orders after the battle. Publius Casca, the first man to plunge his dagger into Caesar, fled Philippi like a ghost. Legend says he wandered the world tormented by guilt until he took his own life in an unknown place. Or perhaps the sea claimed him in a storm. His death is a mystery. His body was never found, as if the earth itself refused to give him burial. The hunt lasted over a decade, demonstrating Octavius's relentless memory. The last of the major assassins to die was Cassius Parmensis, a poet and writer who had put his pen in service of the Republic. After Philippi, his life was an odyssey of escapes. He joined the pirate Sextus Pompey in Sicily. When Pompey was defeated, he committed the most ironic act of all. He joined Mark Antony, Caesar's assassin and avenger, against Caesar's son, but chose the losing side for the last time. After Antony's final defeat at the Battle of Actium, more than 14 years after the assassination, Octavius's men finally found him in Athens. He was dragged out and executed without ceremony. With his death, Octavius's list was finally almost complete. One by one, they fell in battles in dark alleys by their own hand or by a traitor's. None of Caesar's assassins died of old age. Most died violently, many with the same daggers they used on the Ides of March, fulfilling a kind of poetic and terrible justice. But as the vengeance was consummated, something else was happening. With every Republican senator who died, with every opponent, silence, the power of one man grew until it became absolute. The assassins stabbed Caesar to kill the idea of a king. In the vacuum they left, they cultivated the birth of something far more powerful and lasting: an emperor. The final irony of their sacrifice had not yet revealed its full magnitude. When the last of the assassins was hunted down and executed, a strange silence fell over the Roman world. For the first time in nearly 20 years, there was no active civil war. The purge was over. But the peace Octavius brought was the peace of a graveyard. An entire generation of the Roman aristocracy, the men who had led the Senate and commanded the legions for centuries, was dead, murdered in the proscriptions fallen at Philippi, or purged in the subsequent wars. The triumvirs pact forged in the blood of their enemies could not last. With the world at their feet, the last two predators, Mark Antony and Octavius, turned on each other. It was a war of propaganda before it was a war of swords. Octavius from Rome painted Antony as a traitor, a Roman general enslaved by a foreign queen who wanted to rule Rome from Egypt. Antony from Alexandria saw Octavius as a tyrannical usurper, a greedy boy clinging to power. The final confrontation came at sea in the Battle of Actium. It was the last convulsion of the dying republic. Octavius's victory was total. Mark Antony and Cleopatra fled to Egypt, where cornered, and with no escape they took their own lives. The general threw himself on his sword. The queen, according to legend, let herself be bitten by an asp. With their deaths, the last challenge to Octavius's power vanished. Now he stood alone, utterly alone at the top. His father's assassins dead. The old guard of the Senate dead. His rivals Lepidus exiled and Antony dead. He had avenged Caesar in a way not even Julius Caesar could have imagined. He held absolute and undisputed power over an empire stretching from Spain to Syria. And here the final and most crushing irony of the story reveals itself. The liberators stabbed Caesar because they feared he would crown himself king. They feared one man would destroy 500 years of republican tradition. Their act, designed to save the republic, was the catalyst that destroyed it completely. The wars they unleashed annihilated the political class that sustained it, leaving a power vacuum only one man could fill. Octavius learned his father's lesson. He did not declare himself dictator, for life did not wear a crown. He was far cleverer. In the year 27 before Christ, he entered the Senate, and in an act of political genius, renounced all his extraordinary powers and declared the republic restored. It was a brilliant farce. He maintained the appearances of the republic, the consuls, the senators, the assemblies, but concentrated all real power in himself, legally and gradually. Control of the army, the finances, the richest provinces. The Senate, grateful for the peace, granted him a new name, Augustus the Venerable. He became Rome's first emperor. He ruled with power more absolute than Caesar ever dreamed of, and did so for over 40 years. He died an old man in his bed, deified as a god. Brutus Cassius and the others killed a man to prevent a king. The result of their sacrifice was not freedom, but the creation of an emperor and the birth of the Roman Empire. In the end, they did not save the republic. They only ensured that all who believed in it died, clearing the way for the new order. Their fight for freedom was the stepping stone on which Augustus built his throne. The 23 stabs in the Senate floor did not prevent tyranny. They only chose the tyrant.